We chose to cover misconceptions that international students and faculty have about American students and vice versa, because our backgrounds were widely not diverse, especially in high school. Purdue is a highly diverse university, and so it became immediately clear to us that this would be an interesting topic, especially after reading the articles in class.
So now we're going to look at the first interview that we held, and we're going to call her Jane Doe. She was born in southern China, and she's currently a Purdue faculty and has been for over 20 years. She got all of her schooling plus a master's degree in China, and then came here, got another master's degree, and then also got her PhD. She also has a high school son who is in Lafayette, and so we chose her because we just thought that it would be really good for our findings to have a faculty and a student. And we also just really enjoyed her background of having a lot of schooling done in China and also a lot here in the US as well. We did an interview face-to-face with her, and some things that we learned were, we first just learned that she had so much empathy towards those who had misconceptions or skewed understandings about her and her culture, and so that really surprised us, just how understanding and how natural it was for her to hear that. We also learned that she was really well knowledgeable about the Chinese education system along with the American education system. I think that's really prevalent since she has a son who is in high school, and so she's watching him go through all of it. But that was also really beneficial for her to be able to compare and contrast her schooling with his schooling, even though she didn't have an American high school, middle school, or elementary education. And then we also learned about a multiculturalism training experience that she had. She spoke about her first few years while at Purdue. She was sent to a multiculturalism training seminar with a bunch of other professors. And when she got there, they had to get in groups and talk and answer some questions. And they were supposed to talk about misconceptions that they had or just thoughts they had about other cultures. And she said that one professor spoke to her about how he thought his students who were Chinese couldn't think independently. And he thought this because they never came to him and questioned their grade or questioned points. They just took the grades that he gave them. And so with that, he came to a conclusion that they couldn't think independently. And in her point of view, she said that in their school system in China, it is so rigid and so strict, and it's disrespectful to question a teacher, and it's disrespectful to combat what they've given you. And so that was just a misconception that she gave us, and was just a really good example for us to see how someone here in the US had a misconception about another culture. And so that was really beneficial.
The second interview we conducted, we'll call him John Doe, is a current engineering student in his undergrad. He was born in Singapore. We chose him because, like Allie said, we wanted a diverse range of perspectives. The faculty member had a lot of experience under her belt, but he did not. We did his interview face-to-face. Basically what we learned from his interview is that he had, much like the faculty member, very neutral feelings. He had not experienced anything very negative. He was very humble and understanding of the differences that he has. He had a very strong understanding of the different education systems between the US and Singapore. While Singapore very rigidly focuses on STEM, he said while the American education system is getting there, it was nothing compared to Singapore's. He also said that he understands why Americans would have misconceptions about where he's from, because Singapore is so far away from America and it's very small. He said that he understood why Americans might have misconceptions about where he came from, because Singapore, while he said Americans believed was part of China, is actually a very small independent country in the middle of the Indian Ocean. But because it's so far away, he was humble in understanding that that is just an understanding that we had. He said Purdue does a very excellent job of being inclusive. He says he feels very welcome here, and that the extracurriculars and the clubs that we have allow him to feel like this is a second.
Okay, so now with this graph, we're going to look at the questions that we asked the interviewer, not all of them, just a few, and then we'll look at what the research says compared to what the interviewer's response was. So the first question that we asked was, can you think through some misconceptions that you've experienced while in your education system in America? One of the researches that we found talked about how Chinese students reported feeling concerned about the critical thinking because it went against what they were taught. When one was questioned or explored alternative routes of what, oh, why am I reading off the slide? Okay, I shouldn't have done that. Okay. Oh, I'm starving. Okay. So now that we know a little bit about both of the interviews that we conducted, we're going to look at some of the questions that we asked both of the interviewers and then, or interviewees. Dang it. Okay. So now that we've looked at both of the interviews that we conducted and who they are and kind of some things that they had said about the questions we've asked them, we're going to look more specifically at the questions that we asked. Then we're going to compare that to research that we found and their answers. So the first question that we asked was, can you think through some misconceptions you experienced while in the education system of America? So in one of the research articles that we've Sorry, I was talking really fast. Okay.
We should definitely have a blooper reel for 100%.
Yeah, no.
Just a couple seconds.
I think, but it's like, it'll just be me burping. Okay. So now that we've looked at who the interviewees are and some information about them, we're going to look at some specific questions and then compare what research has told us and then their answers. So the first, one of the questions that we asked Jane Doe was, can you think through some misconceptions you experienced while in the education system in America? And research we found said that students were reported feeling concerned and worried about critical thinking because they felt like it went against or opposed what the professor had taught. And then her response, if you remember earlier when we talked about her multiculturalism seminar that she had to go to, was very similar to that students did not feel comfortable with opposing or going against what the professor said. And so those two things line up, which is cool. Another question we asked Jane Doe was there ever a time when you felt offended with the material being taught or felt that it came across insensitive to your culture? Please explain. She didn't have a specific instance in her head where it felt insensitive or that it like upset her with the material that was being taught, but she did talk about how in their culture it's also, oh shoot, I'm gonna restart that part. Thinks that her culture is often misinterpreted as unable to think deeply and be creative. She described their education system as, oh shoot, that's what it was. Okay, I remember. Okay, I have to hold my hands behind my back because I fidget with them. Really? Oh yeah, power stance is what that is. Okay. Okay, so now that we've looked at both of the interviewees and a little bit about them, we are going to look more specifically at questions that we asked them. Then we're going to compare the research that we found with their answers and just see how those things compare and contrast. So the first question we asked Jane Doe was, can you think through some misconceptions you've experienced while in the education system of America? Research told us that Chinese students reported feeling concerned about critical thinking because they felt like it went against or opposed the education that they were being taught, which wasn't okay. And if you remember Jane Doe's response earlier when we talked about her, that was something that a professor had also had misconceptions about, that his students couldn't think deeply because they weren't opposing or questioning their grade. But research shows us that Chinese students have this barrier where they don't feel that it's appropriate, or in their school system where they were raised that that's not something that you do. So that was really cool that those two things kind of correlate. The next question that we asked Jane was there ever a time when you felt offended with the material being taught or felt that it came across insensitive to your culture? Our research showed that Chinese students coming to America, they struggle with logical thinking because they come from a very more rigid school system, and we've mentioned this before in our presentation, but Jane didn't necessarily have an experience that made her feel misinterpreted, not misinterpreted, insensitive, more misinterpreted. And so an example that she gave for this question was that she thinks that Chinese students are often mistaken as being rigid and not being able to be creative and think out of the box. And she accredited this to their school system starting from age kindergarten, and that their school system has such a great focus on the assessment that comes after high school that determines your placement for college, that their focus is so set on that there's no room to deviate from that path. And so their creativity isn't an option because there are other things to be learning, to get better at, to pass this test, to be able to go to a good college. And so that's what she accredited it to. But I think that oftentimes, she said, other people think that it's just Chinese students who just aren't creative and that's just their, like, the nature of them, when that's not what she was saying. She was saying it was because of the school system and how they were raised. So that was really interesting.
Coming into this project, we thought both of our interviewees would have some kind of misconceptions in their education. Most people do not realize that these misconceptions are happening in schools, but after learning about multiculturalism in education, we figured it would be everywhere. Since we go to such a big school with about 43,000 students, we thought it would be easy to find international people who had negative experiences, but we struggled. After we talked to both interviewees, we found out that both participants experienced some kind of misconception, but they both had an open mind and understood the commonality of these misconceptions about international people.
Throughout the semester, we talked a lot about empathy, and as we were doing our project, we realized that it is a common theme. Jane Doe was very empathetic about how Americans do not always understand her culture, and it was very inspiring because we realized we need to be very empathetic and sensitive to others' cultures. John Doe was also very kind and aware about Americans not fully grasping what his culture is like. He was also very understanding that his school system is different than the American school system. We do not always need to 100% understand what other cultures are, but it is so valuable to be able to be aware and sensitive to how what we think can be stereotypical and generic, also known as misconceptions.
We hope you enjoyed.